The time has finally come. After 5 years, the game is out. I thought the unit creator seemed like an improbability at the time, yet here we are. Before we get stuck into the game itself, however, the full release came along with some new content, so I will quickly give my thoughts. The glowing door from a couple years ago opened, which housed the fantasy good faction. It seems the historical context for factions has been ditched entirely, but that did allow them to create some spectacular units that just would not have existed otherwise. The update also introduced another faction, MediEvil, which can be found under the spooky version of the exact same map. I noted in my spooky faction video that the unit lineup was similar in function. Now add on the fact they use the same maps, and on top of that house morally opposing factions within those shared maps. This just confirms that the spooky faction was indeed the antithesis to the MediEvil faction. Early similarities were likely created to make it easier for the player to locate the evil faction, which means Landfall was laying the groundwork for a secret nearly 2 years in advance. All of these things could just be a big coincidence though. But anyway, what about those new factions? The Fantasy Good faction has, as you would guess, heavenly themed units with visually stunning moves that reach heights I was not sure Landfall would ever push this game to, and there's also an elephant. The Divine Arbiter and Cheerleader combo have become my new favourite cheese tactic. The Divine Arbiter's attack looks inspired by the Tabs G boss you fight in Purgatory. Accessing these bosses nowadays remains a mystery to me. If you do know, feel free to enlighten the comment section. The Good faction also has a boss unit finally worthy of that title, the Chronomancer, which looks like your average heavenly being before it tears off its mask to release its wait, wrong game. The unit can transform into a god, which deals damage by freezing enemies in place, which is very broken, as it can interrupt attacks and basically stunlock anything. Another highlight of this faction is the Righteous Paladin. Honestly, his attack is just pretty satisfying to watch. The Evil faction is pretty much a sister faction, possessing units similar in function. The Arbiter's counterpart, the Tempest Lich, is easily my favourite of the faction, and of course I paired it with cheerleaders. The boss unit is not as broken, but is certainly as much a spectacle. The update also came with a couple other new additions, one of which is achievements. They start off pretty standard, like simply complete a campaign and the dopamine hit is yours, but then they hit you with the finish legacy campaign without being defeated. In fact, a lot of these seem grindy, which I'm not complaining. Having something in this game I can work towards is fantastic, but I mean... Lastly, there's multiplayer, which is fine. It's just a way to play a very sandbox-inspired mode with a friend over the internet. Seems more like a solution to enjoy tabs with a friend far away than a legitimate multiplayer mode. I was just hoping for something that took advantage of the amazing units in this game, something that would challenge the player and provide a decent skill ceiling that isn't just a sandbox but online. I don't want to come across as I don't like the multiplayer, because for what it's worth it's great, but for someone who knows this game so well I was hoping for a little bit more. Alright, with that out of the way, there is only one thing left to do. Totally accurate battle simulator. I have no idea where to start with this. It feels so odd writing this, as it's something I've been so invested in, and I've made tons of videos on smaller parts of tabs. Just makes it weird to write a comprehensive review of everything with a sense of finality. I guess we'll start with the backbone of this game, the units. At the core of all these units resides the Wobbler, the gaming icon to be, let me tell you. For what is pretty much a low poly man, the Wobbler is surprisingly iconic, even lying at the centre of a few spin-off games. This guy fits so perfectly with the satire name of the game he resides in, but on his own, yeah, he's pretty bland. Add clothes, weapons, and maybe a couple of abilities and you end up with a good unit. Do that 100 times and you've got this game. The diversity of weapons on show here is amazing. Landfall left no gaps in any potential strategy. Oh yeah. The levels in tabs play out like puzzles. You need a team effective enough to beat the one opposing you. Thanks to the variety of well thought out units, levels can get quite tricky and require you to think, instead of just mindlessly spamming Mammoth. There are cheap units, long range support units, close range pressure units, and Doom Guy from Doom... Wait, I should probably save that. Most units have a unique gimmick that sets them out from the rest and provides a reason to use them, but equally have downsides that the player needs to recognise. Normally a unit won't be directly countered by another, and it's more the type of situation that needs to be looked out for when determining who to use. For the most part this is perfectly balanced, and at some point you'll be using each and every unit. But with a lot of units and situations to account for, it's easy to understand how units can start to be organised into tiers. Some units are useful in vast numbers of situations, it's just the gimmick they are assigned lends them more usefulness, like the Berserker. This guy is a cheap melee unit that can leap across large gaps, perfect for taking out ranged units that would otherwise be safe from harm. But this leap also makes the Berserker good at closing any gap, regardless of the unit on the other end, making it a useful unit in most situations. Contrast that with the Ballista, a unit that is insanely good at taking out boss and tank units due to its high damage and attacks. Outside of that role, it's a slightly different story. At the end of the day, every unit has its place, and coming to learn the strengths and drawbacks of each of them will go a long way. Don't let the presentation of this game fool you, it can get brutally hard at points. Most factions are just handed to you with the exception of the Good, Evil and Legacy faction. They really made you work for the Legacy ones, let me tell you. One faction that famously isn't given to you is the Secret faction. A faction comprised of units you have to go and locate. Finding these guys were super fun. Some hidden unit locations is super creative, like for one unit it's not just sitting there, you have to complete an action before it's revealed. My only real criticism is that you don't really get a whole lot of enjoyment out of the moment-to-moment gameplay, because for the most part it doesn't exist. Once you beat a really hard level, yeah, it's satisfaction overload, but aside from that, after extended play sessions, I find my motivation to keep going completely fading away. As after 1 hour long uphill battle to beat a hard level, it's hard to tempt myself into another. To help rectify this issue, Landfall introduced a variety of ways for the player to get involved with the battle. The first feature they introduced was unit possession, the ability to take control over any one of your units during a battle. This is a fun little feature and one of my personal favourite aspects of the game. It works quite well and it gives you full control over a unit, being able to use its abilities and attack whenever you please. Turns a piece on the battlefield into a fully playable character, and you controlling it has the potential to heavily affect the outcome of the battle. This feature isn't without its downsides though. Due to the Wobbler's heavily personalized approach to existence, they can't walk straight, which gets old, and quickly at that. Also, with ranged units you don't have full control over aiming. Horizontally it's fine, but vertically you're heavily restrained. Looking at the unit possession when it was being showed off in its early stages, it looks way more fluid and less restrictive. Why didn't they just give us this version? I've seen some speculate that it's because it's being used for the upcoming hero unit, but it could also be that what we got was more in line with the personality of the units and the tab's brand. The next feature is the Bug DLC. First of all, the name is great. I mean, it's a little basic, sure, but it's apt for what you get and fits so well alongside the satire names of Landfall's portfolio. This basically just adds a bunch of cheats that allow you to do a bunch of stupid things like invert gravity, make units big, and piling mammoths on top of each other. It's a fun little distraction for about an hour, but I rarely see myself using them. It is also quite a fun callback to when cheats used to be more abundant in games, and where popping a code in would net you infinite lives or something, so it's not a bad feature. Overall, being able to interact with battles is a nice addition, but aren't as well baked into the game as the units themselves, so they do feel like something cool you can do on the side rather than a prominent feature. In some respects, it does rectify the issue of there being not really any moment-to-moment gameplay to keep you entertained, but doesn't fully solve the problem. This feeling can be offset, however, as Landfall introduced a variety of ways for you to create your own content in this game. Let's start with the campaign and level creator. This feature is pretty much what it says on the tin. Using the existing maps, you can place whatever units you wish and upload it for the world to play. Even before the unit creator came out, these custom levels were a treat. I mean, like most pools of user created levels, you do have to dig through them for the good ones, but campaigns like Unit Possession and Final Destination were so well thought out you'd be forgiven for thinking they were official. Providing this feature alone was a smart idea for Landfall. I mean, it increases the shelf life of the game for sure, but the abundance of well thought out units that complement each other this well is way too vast for Landfall to get everything out of and realise their full potential. And so giving this tool to the player allows them to find combat puzzles and unit compositions that Landfall would never have thought of. At this point, I felt like the game had peaked. But then, without sounding dramatic, the unit creator added so much value to this game it almost felt like a sequel. That sounded pretty dramatic. The level of customization in Unit Creator was insane, plus they ported everything over from Tab G, along with adding a lot of additional weapons and clothing. The short of it, there was plenty of content to occupy yourself with. On top of that, the addition of the unit creator allowed custom levels to take an entirely new form, an evolved form. Not only would the combat puzzles be unique, but the units that make the puzzles up would also be unique. The level of creativity in custom levels went through the roof overnight. But again, if you want the good ones, you need to start digging. Sadly, a lot of my previous creations are stranded on my old computer, and looking back at the horrors, I think it's probably for the best. Although there were a couple that to this day I remain proud of. Thankfully, my glorious Shrek track lives on, and whatever this is also survived. I'm worried what was going through my head when I created this. Just going into the unit creator and spending 20 minutes creating God knows what is enjoyable, coming up with viable units or creating godlike beings just to watch them completely annihilate an entire screen of enemies. Like mentioned earlier, the biggest takeaway I had from this is how it improved custom levels. I mean, there was a lot to occupy yourself with, but eventually you'd be burnt out. And so having a higher quality of community-made levels is great, as now there's an endless supply of completely unique parts of the game. All they need now to round this all off is a map creator, although I feel that's a little bit too advanced for this game. Overall, both these features means that the lifespan of tabs has increased way past what it otherwise would have been, and takes an already content-dense game and increases that tenfold. The maps and music are both fairly standard, nothing really jumps out at me. The music is all thematically appropriate for the time period they represent, and without knowing the context, I'm sure someone will be able to figure out what it's representing. My favourite track of the entire game is still the simulation music, with the spooky track in a close second. The maps are like the music in that they're pretty good but not stand out. There are some odd pathfinding issues with Ancient 1, where if a unit is standing on the bridge, enemy units will just circle the building next to it indefinitely. My favourite map has to be either one of the spooky maps. I just really like the atmosphere of these maps, plus I'm quite fond of Halloween themed things anyway. I own 3 ways to play MediEvil. That's it then. That's everything. We've covered every aspect of the game. It's now time to elaborate on things I don't like or just general criticisms I have of tabs. The number one biggest criticism is the lack of any meaningful progression. In a game that doesn't really have much in the way of moment-to-moment gameplay, rewarding the player to continue to put hours in would have been very appreciated. As like mentioned earlier, after playing for a long time, the only real enjoyment you get is finally beating a level. And once you've done that, the motivation drops off completely, and I rarely find myself playing 2 hard levels in a row, as by the first one, I'm already done for the day. The challenges are a nice addition, but you don't get rewarded anything in-game for doing them. It would be nice to have milestones that net you extra weapons for the unit creator, or challenges that net you secret units. Finding the hidden ones is great, and I thought they took a step in the right direction with the Legacy, Good and Evil factions, but having the player complete tasks outside of simply finding the units would have been amazing. Also, like mentioned earlier, multiplayer implementation was disappointing to me personally. Maybe I just got my hopes up after the teased Tabs chess prototype, but having something a little bit more involved that challenged the player's knowledge of each unit and encouraged strategic thinking was what I was hoping for in a multiplayer experience. Though I am aware that Landfall's target audience for this game is people much younger than I am. It's just a shame they don't use their well-designed game to its full potential. Alright, it's judgment time. Yeah, this game's fantastic. The base campaigns are fun, and the fact there is a near endless supply of community-made stuff means you'll be occupied for a while. The unit creator in this game is one of the most robust character creation tools I've seen in a while. The units are very well thought out, leading to an experience that is so much more in depth than the presentation gives it credit for.